In 1869, the state of Wyoming was the first state to grant women's suffrage and also helped inspire other states to adopt similar legislation granting women the right to vote. The success in Wyoming is a chapter in a larger story of the effort to gain the rights for women in the United States. These efforts continued until 1920, when the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted all women the right to vote. Following the adoption of the Constitution in 1779 and the adoption of the Bill of Rights in 1793, women began to actively work to gain the rights to give them greater equality with the men. During the 1800s, only men who owned land were eligible to vote. Most of the women at this time could not even vote at all. These women were looked upon as someone to cook, clean, take care of the children, and manage the household. These women were denied their basic rights, such as the right to vote, right to own property, and also were not paid the same amount of money as men. The idea of equality for men and women was first introduced by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton was first encountered to this issue when she and other women delegates were denied a spot at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London because of their sex. From Stanton's trip to London, she was more determined to change women's rights in the United States. Stanton stated, "My experience at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, all I had read of the legal status of women, and the oppression I saw everywhere, together swept across my soul, intensified by now by many personal experiences." Stanton was angered by these rejections and decided to hold her own convention, which was known as the Seneca Falls Convention, held in 1848. This convention focused on the right of women to vote in the United States. During this convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments, which was an agenda for women's activism for the years to come. The document was based on the Declaration of Independence. A passage from this actual document states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." It was signed by 100 out of the 300 attendees, but it had no immediate effect in giving women their right. It did, however, spark further debate of the idea of equality for women. In 1851, Stanton began working with Susan B. Anthony, a well-known abolitionist. Both of these women made a great team. Anthony managed the business affairs of women's rights movement, while Stanton did all the writing. Together, these two women edited and published a women's newspaper called The Revolution from 1868 to 1870. The motto of this newspaper was, "Men, their rights, and nothing more. Women, their rights are nothing less." Frederick Douglass also played a major role in the women's rights movement. Stanton and Douglass teamed up and thought of ways of how they could fight for equality and suffrage. Douglass wrote an issue of the North Star. "In respect to political rights, we hold women to be justly entitled to all we claim for man. We go further and express our conviction that all political rights, which it is expedient for a man to exercise, is equally so for women. All that distinguishes men as intelligent and accountable beings is equally true for women. And if that government is only just which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying women the exercise of elective franchise or a hand in making and administrating the laws of land." In 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded on May 15, 1869, in New York City. This association strived to achieve women's suffrage vote through a constitutional amendment and also a push for other women's rights. Also in 1869, Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and Julia Ward Howe, and other more conservative activists, formed the American Women's Suffrage Association to work for women's suffrage through amending individual state constitutions. The Western suffrage story began when Wyoming transferred a dream into reality in 1869. That year, the 20-member territorial legislature approved a revolutionary measure stating that every woman of the age 21 years residing in this territory made every election to be holden under the law, therefore cast her own vote. The Wyoming Territory was made up of all men and was the first government to guarantee women's rights to vote. These men fought for the right for women to retain their voting rights in 1890. The Wyoming Territory was known for having the nation's first female law enforcement for two reasons. The first reason was the men thought the women deserved the right to vote, and the second reason was it was good advertisement for the territory. The Wyoming Territory thought that if they granted the right for women to vote in Wyoming, their population would increase. In 1870, Eliza Swain cast her first female vote in Wyoming. Esther Morris and Caroline Neal were appointed justices of the peace of Sweetwater County. A key person during the Wyoming suffrage movement was Mary Goddard Bellamy, who was the first woman to be elected to the legislature in the state's history. Her 1910 election made Wyoming the third state to have female presence in its legislature, following only Colorado in 1894 and Utah in 1896. She was a strong advocate for women's ability to hold public office. In one of her speeches, she states, "Men are willing to elect those women that run. You see, in Wyoming, when it comes to politics, the men don't think of women as women, but as citizens. They are willing to accord us equal rights with themselves, to consider what we want, and it seems desirable to grant it. Between the men and the women of this state, there is a sympathetic understanding and the best kind of cooperation, working together for the good of Wyoming. There is no sex antagonism here, and consequently no opposition to women holding office." Mary Goddard Bellamy was the founder of the League of Women's Voters and was a delegate for the National Rally for Women's Suffrage in 1917. William Bright was the Wyoming Territory legislator most responsible for securing women the right to vote in Wyoming. In 1869, he was elected to the first territorial legislature as a Democrat. Also in the same year, he sponsored the women's suffrage bill. He believed that if African Americans could vote, then women should also be allowed to vote as well. John A. Campbell also played a major role in the Wyoming suffrage movement. He was the first governor of the Wyoming Territory. He appreciated the publicity power of the policy and signed the bill into law, making Wyoming the first territory or state in history of the nation to grant women this fundamental right of citizenship. The bill that he had signed was an act to grant to the women of Wyoming Territory the right of suffrage and to hold office. Through the efforts of these hardworking individuals, the Territory of Wyoming granted full suffrage to women on December 10, 1869. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Stanton was the first president of this association. The association focuses on the efforts of securing suffrage at the state level. After women were granted the right to vote in Wyoming, several states followed in Wyoming's footsteps and decided to grant women suffrage. By the 1900s, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho joined Wyoming in allowing women the right to vote. The states in the north, such as Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts, continued to reject women's suffrage until 1915. The time period of the 1890s to the 1920s was termed the Progressive Era. Women from all classes and backgrounds entered into the public life. Women's roles expanded and resulted in an increase of the politicalization of women. Consequently, the issue of women's suffrage became a mainstream politics. In 1918, President Woodrow Wilson stated his support for a federal women's suffrage amendment. He agreed that he would address the Senate about adopting women's suffrage at the end of World War I. In 1919, the Senate finally passes the 19th Amendment. On August 26, 1920, all American women won full voting rights. The 19th Amendment states, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation."